Hi, this is Casey Smith, and this is my video submission for the mentoring reflection portion of Module 1. Garvey, Stokes, and Megginson offer quite a bit of historical background for the fact that mentoring has existed since the time of the ancient Greeks, as seen in Homer's Odyssey, as well as in the Indo-European root for men, which means to think, and the ancient Greek word mentor, which means advisor. This is especially interesting for a bilingual person such as myself and a person who is interested in the role that language plays in our world and in our perspectives and creation of perspectives. And if you fast forward to the 18th century, there were several writers that were referenced who wrote about the process of mentoring, even if they didn't necessarily have the language at the time that modern researchers use to refer to mentoring. The most succinct and all-encompassing definition for mentoring comes from the Bozeman and Feeney article, where they describe mentoring as a process for the informal transmission of knowledge, social capital, and psychosocial support perceived by the recipient as relevant to work, career, or professional development. Mentoring entails informal communication, usually face-to-face and during a sustained period of time, between a person who is perceived to have greater relevant knowledge, wisdom, or experience, the mentor, and a person who is perceived to have less, the protege. In the remainder of this video submission, I'm going to outline what I perceived as the key components of mentoring, both from the literature as well as class discussion boards, as well as some tensions that I identified in the literature and from classmates. And then I will address some connections that I have reflected on in my previous experience, and we'll finalize with some concluding thoughts. So on to the key components, and these are in no particular order, but when it comes to the mentoring process, it seems that trust is something that is important for both parties to be willing to be open to. Sarah Thorndike, a classmate, referenced that when the relationship is built on trust and people are open to sharing their vulnerabilities, their fears, their goals and aspirations, that it creates a judgment-free zone, and that's a place where people are really ultimately going to have more of an opportunity to grow. And growing is probably, if I had to pick one aspect of mentoring that was most key, I think if you're coming to a mentoring relationship, either as the mentor or the protege, and you're not willing to and interested in personal growth, professional growth, then it's really probably not going to be successful for both parties. So that's an important aspect that another classmate noted in the quote pictured. Reflection is also a large part of learning, and another classmate noted the ability for both parties, when they do have that trust and they do have that mutual respect, to ultimately grow based on their reflections through their conversations. And I find this to be relevant in all different scenarios of learning. As a classroom teacher, I know that reflection is the single most important thing that I can ask my students to do throughout their learning process, so that ultimately they are growing even afterwards, to be able to reflect on the process. Both parties have to have a willingness to practice self-awareness. Garvey, in his video as well as the textbook, notes the importance of each person knowing their role and the expectations in their relationship. And I equated this to essentially having a set of norms that he references are necessary to be repeated and returned to often, so that that self-awareness is constantly being practiced, and both individuals are engaged in what their responsibilities are in their relationship. A willingness to practice listening, and I might be adding the adjective empathic listening here. This was a theme throughout discussion boards as well as the literature that is really important, especially on the part of the mentor, probably more so for the mentor than the protege, I would argue, but still equally important, rather still important for both parties. If the mentor can encourage an environment that is open to vulnerability, open to honesty, open to constructive criticism without feeling like there's judgment, then that's an important piece for mentoring to be successful. And another aspect that's really fun, in my opinion, is the fact that mentoring is a nonlinear process. It's not something that starts at a particular point and necessarily has a defined end goal, or that necessarily is a straight trajectory. Neither is learning in general. So this is something that Garvey and his colleagues reference in the text, that Alan, my classmate, noted as well, that it's not a linear progression. And in fact, Megginson and Clutterbuck's previous research that Garvey et al. Cite in the text talks about the movement between these 7 different types of dialogue, that you can move in between these in one sitting in a mentoring conversation. You might stay within one of these dialogues in one sitting. You might, throughout the relationship, move back and forth between each of these different dialogues, which each have different purposes and are all really going to be dependent upon what the protege needs in that moment, or what their ultimate end goals are. And along those lines comes the idea that mentoring can be a formal or informal process. Another classmate, Clay, noted that a lot of times mentoring happens most formally in professional environments, and it certainly happens in non-professional and casual relationships too. And I would add to that even in a professional environment, there can be not necessarily casual, but informal mentoring processes. And along these lines comes the idea of having a structured agenda versus sort of an ability or a willingness to go with the flow in terms of the direction of the conversation between the mentor and the protege. And finally, again, for me as a bilingual individual and a person who's very interested in language, this is something that I probably perceived and drew out without it being explicitly stated in the literature, that there has to be a willingness on both individuals' parts, and especially the part of the mentor, to engage in a heightened awareness to the use of language. If I'm going to be a good empathic listener, I'm going to have heightened my senses to the language that the protege is using, so that I can ultimately help to guide them with the reflective questioning techniques to kind of explicate meaning, as the quote says, to getting towards what that end goal is, or what the struggle is, or where the tension is. And in the beginning of the text, there are 4 main discourses that are referenced from Western's work that are the 4 main discourses that mentoring typically occurs within. And so I think moving into any kind of mentoring relationship, moving forward, it would be important for me or for our classmates to think about which one of these discourses they identify with most, or which one they think might be most beneficial in a particular context. And it's also a good reflective opportunity to look back at different mentoring relationships and consider which one of these discourses was that relationship sort of primarily focusing under and functioning under. Now I'll move on to some tensions that I noted in the literature, and these are actually not all of the tensions that I initially thought of including, but I'm going to talk about 3. The first is just the general tension that exists within the research up until this point. Bozeman and Feeney discuss the fact that a lot of the research findings are listings of empirical results, and that there has been this difficulty in the past in defining what mentoring is. And I think that this is has its advantages and disadvantages, because when we do define something, we tend to narrow down the possibilities of what can fall within its umbrella, so to speak. But this is something I think that moving forward, it will be good for practitioners to have a little bit more clarity in terms of the theoretical models that support mentoring in different cases. Another tension that I noticed is relevant to the K through 12 and even the K through 20 curriculum processes and sort of the environment and the culture that we have established in the United States a lot of times is because of our accountability culture and our accountability model. It tends to be a linear process, and learning tends to be a linear activity. We tend to see that, there is this end goal of a certain type of and amount of learning that should occur. And so there's a tension that exists in mentoring experiences because of this. And it's not just relevant because of educational field, but also within business fields, because as Garvey et al. Reference, there is this sort of assumption that we have a particular way to measure the performance of individuals and organizations, and that can be inhibiting, I think, to the myriad possibilities that mentoring offers for improvement and for performance. And the final tension that I noted had to do with mental health issues and concerns. I find so far in the literature that there's not a lot apparent to address the fact that a mentor could be working with a protege that has mental health issues. We know that 1 in 4 individuals in society in general lives with a mental health concern or mental health illness. So I thought this was a piece of the literature so far for me that left some tensions because of a personal experience I've had and left some questions unanswered. So we'll be curious to see how those might be informed as the studying continues. Now on to some connections that I made in the readings and studying. I'm a big fan of Dr. Brené Brown, who is a self-described shame researcher. And in her book, Daring Greatly, where she reveals a lot of the research on shame and the requirement of vulnerability to remove and overcome shame and guilt, she discusses a lot of aspects that I certainly connected with the soul guide discourse. And in her other book, Braving the Wilderness, there's an entire area of her research that labels what she describes speaking truth to bullshit. And that was an interesting connection for me with the Garvey et al. Text, where they talk about the potential power of learning conversations to lead and shape and build changing attitudes, behaviors, and performance in the workplace. So that's very much tied to what Brené Brown describes as having the courage and the willingness to stand up and speak from your own place of truth about or towards something that otherwise might have become kind of a toxic culture in society or in the culture that you work within, or even within just one personal relationship, such as a mentoring one. And the other connection I made is with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. The 5th habit is to seek first to understand, then to be understood. And he talks about the progression of moving from a listener who mimics to one who rephrases the content that they're hearing, to one that reflects the feeling that they're hearing behind that content, and then ultimately, hopefully, being able to rephrase content and reflect the feeling at the same time. And a lot of the discussion of listening paralleled this process, although I did notice the tension with the need a lot of times in our discussion board, the need to use autobiographical experiences, which Covey actually would argue against, but I also recognize that his book is not about mentoring per se, whereas everything we're reading is about mentoring. Finally, there are 3 concluding thoughts which represent the 3 sort of strongest ponderings that I had throughout the studying, as well as that I walk away with from this piece of Module 1. The number 1 is that the person in a position of power has a tremendous responsibility and a moral obligation, especially if they're working in a mentoring scenario where they are a superior to the protege. That comes with an extra layer of responsibility to act and perform in that role with a greater integrity. Second is that having a common definition and expectations being clearly established is really important in whatever your setting is. If it's within, in my case, a school district or a school, or in just a one-on-one scenario working between one mentor and protege. So that's something that I certainly take away from this as significant. And finally, just looking forward to exploring what guidance there might be out there for a person who is working as a mentor, as I have in the past, in a situation where the protege has a mental illness, or even if there's not a diagnosis of a mental illness, certainly there are situations where psychological influences on a person's behavior might affect their ability or their willingness or their effectiveness to apply what they're learning in a mentoring relationship. This concludes my video submission, and here are my references. Thanks for listening.